Abandoned baby velociraptor begs for help. Then something shocking happens. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The dense jungle canopy was alive with sounds, from the chirps of birds to the rustling of leaves as small creatures scurried about. But amidst the usual symphony of life, a faint, almost pitiful cry echoed through the underbrush. It was a sound that didn't belong, a desperate, high-pitched whimper that carried a sense of vulnerability and fear. In a small clearing, partially obscured by ferns, a tiny velociraptor lay trembling. Its scales, a soft mix of green and brown, were streaked with mud, and one of its small legs was twisted awkwardly beneath its fragile body. The little creature blinked up at the towering trees, its large amber eyes shimmering with tears. Alone and defenseless, it cried out again, a heartbreaking plea for help in a world that often showed none. The velociraptor had been left behind by its pack, a group of swift, fierce hunters who prioritized survival above all else. When it had stumbled during a chase, its tiny foot caught in a tangle of roots. The others had barely hesitated. Survival in the wild meant no room for weakness, and the pack had moved on, their sleek forms disappearing into the dense foliage. But for this abandoned baby, the reality of being alone was stark and terrifying. It had no protection, no guidance, and no hope of finding food or safety on its own. The jungle, with all its beauty, was also a place of danger, and the velociraptor's cries seemed to draw the attention of creatures that lurked in the shadows. Nearby, a human explorer named Ethan was making his way through the jungle. Dressed in rugged boots and a weathered jacket, he carried a pack filled with tools, maps, and a camera slung around his neck. Ethan was no stranger to the wild. He had spent years studying the remnants of prehistoric ecosystems in remote areas, driven by an unrelenting passion for understanding the creatures that once ruled the earth. As he pushed through the thick vegetation, Ethan paused, his ears catching a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, almost like a bird's chirp, but there was something hauntingly desperate about it. He stood still, his trained instincts telling him to pay attention. What was that? He muttered to himself, scanning the area. He adjusted his hat and moved toward the sound, careful to tread lightly. The jungle was full of surprises, and not all of them were pleasant. The cries grew louder as Ethan approached, his curiosity piqued. Finally, he emerged into the small clearing, his breath catching at the sight before him. There, nestled among the ferns, was the tiny velociraptor. Its delicate frame shivered with fear, and its wide, amber eyes locked onto Ethan's towering figure. For a moment, neither moved. Ethan's heart raced as he took in the scene. A living, breathing velociraptor, something he had only dreamed of encountering. But it was clear the creature was in trouble. Its leg was injured, and its cries were filled with pain and desperation. "Hey there," Ethan said softly, his voice gentle as he crouched down. He knew he needed to be careful. Even a baby velociraptor could be dangerous if it felt threatened. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you," the velociraptor whimpered, its small claws digging into the dirt as it tried to push itself away. But it was too weak, its body trembling from exhaustion and fear. Ethan reached into his pack, pulling out a small piece of dried meat he had brought as a snack. He held it out cautiously, his hand steady. "Here, little one. It's food. You must be hungry." The velociraptor hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent. Hunger overpowered fear, and it slowly inched forward, its movements tentative and wary. It snapped up the meat, chewing frantically as if it hadn't eaten in days. Ethan smiled, relief washing over him. "That's it. You're going to be okay." Over the next hour, Ethan worked to gain the creature's trust. He spoke to it in soothing tones, offering more bits of food and carefully observing its behavior. The velociraptor, though wary, seemed to sense that he meant no harm. Its trembling subsided, and its large eyes followed his every movement. Ethan examined the injured leg, his heart sinking as he realized the extent of the damage. The joint was swollen, and the small creature flinched in pain when he touched it. It would need care, and leaving it here wasn't an option. Alone, it wouldn't survive the night. "All right, little one," Ethan said, reaching for a soft cloth from his pack. "I'm going to help you, but you'll need to trust me." Gently, he wrapped the cloth around the Velociraptor's leg, creating a makeshift splint to stabilize the injury. The creature whimpered but didn't resist, its instincts seemingly telling it that this strange human was its only chance. Once the splint was secure, Ethan carefully lifted the Velociraptor into his arms. It was surprisingly light, its body warm and fragile against his chest. The little creature let out a soft chirp, nestling closer as if seeking comfort. Ethan's heart ached as he cradled the Velociraptor. "Don't worry," he murmured. "You're not alone anymore." Carrying the Velociraptor, Ethan began the trek back to his campsite. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the fading light casting long shadows across the underbrush. But despite the challenges, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had dedicated his life to studying the past, but this was something different. This was about survival, about connection, about giving a helpless creature a chance. As they approached the camp, Ethan's thoughts raced. He would need to create a safe environment for the Velociraptor, a place where it could heal and regain its strength. He also needed to figure out what to feed it. Its diet likely consisted of small prey, but he would have to improvise. Setting the creature down gently on a blanket, Ethan began gathering supplies. He boiled water, prepared some soft meat, and set up a small enclosure to keep the Velociraptor safe. All the while, the little creature watched him, its eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and trust. That night, as the jungle buzzed with nocturnal life, Ethan sat by the campfire, the Velociraptor curled up beside him. It had stopped trembling, its breathing steady as it rested. Ethan couldn't help but smile as he watched it, marveling at its resilience. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said softly. "I think I'll call you Nova. It suits you." A little star in the middle of all this chaos, the Velociraptor chirped softly, as if acknowledging its new name. Ethan chuckled, feeling a connection to the creature that he couldn't quite explain. In the span of a single day, Nova had gone from a lonely, abandoned hatchling to a companion who had already changed Ethan's life. As the fire crackled and the stars shimmered above, Ethan made a silent promise. He would do everything in his power to protect Nova, to give it a chance at the life it deserved. And though he didn't know what challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. Their journey together was only just beginning. The jungle awoke with the sounds of birds and distant howls, signaling the start of another day. Ethan stretched as he stepped out of his tent, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. He glanced down at Nova, who was still curled up on the blanket but stirred slightly at the sound of movement. "Good morning, Nova," Ethan said, crouching beside the little Velociraptor. He carefully unwrapped the makeshift splint to check on the injury. Though the swelling had reduced slightly, Nova let out a soft whimper as Ethan gently felt along its leg. "It's going to take time," Ethan murmured, "but we'll get you back on your feet." He pulled out a small bowl of softened meat he had prepared earlier and set it down in front of Nova. The young Velociraptor sniffed at the offering before eagerly devouring it, its tiny teeth tearing into the food with surprising ferocity. "You've got quite the appetite," Ethan said with a chuckle. "That's a good sign." As Nova ate, Ethan began to plan his day. He needed to secure more food for the Velociraptor, as well as gather materials to reinforce the small enclosure he had set up. Though the jungle was relatively quiet now, he knew the risks that came with staying in such a wild environment, especially with a vulnerable creature like Nova to protect. By mid-morning, Ethan had ventured deeper into the jungle, carrying a small basket for gathering supplies. He kept his machete close at hand, the blade gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Every so often, he paused to listen for any unusual sounds, his senses on high alert. As he searched for fruit and edible plants, his thoughts kept drifting back to Nova. In all his years of studying prehistoric ecosystems, he had never imagined he would encounter a living Velociraptor, let alone bond with one. Yet, despite the challenges, he felt an unshakable resolve to protect the little creature. While gathering supplies near a cluster of ferns, Ethan heard a rustling noise behind him. He froze, his hand instinctively tightening around the machete. Slowly, he turned, his heart pounding as he scanned the dense foliage. The rustling grew louder, and a shadow moved between the trees. Ethan braced himself, his muscles tensing as the figure stepped into view. It was a large predator, its sleek form covered in mottled brown and green scales. A member of Nova's species, no doubt, a fully grown velociraptor, its sharp eyes locking onto Ethan with predatory focus. Ethan's mind raced. He knew enough about velociraptors to understand the danger he was in. Alone and unarmed save for his machete, he stood little chance against the creature if it decided to attack. Slowly, he began to back away, his movements deliberate and measured. The velociraptor tilted its head, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Ethan realized it had likely caught Nova's scent on his clothing. "Easy," Ethan said under his breath, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm not a threat." The velociraptor took a step closer, its claws clicking against the ground. Ethan continued to back away, his eyes never leaving the creature. But just as the tension reached its peak, a loud screech echoed through the jungle. The adult velociraptor froze, its head snapping toward the source of the sound. Another screech followed, this one closer, and the predator let out a low growl before turning and darting back into the underbrush. Ethan exhaled, his chest heaving as the adrenaline subsided. He waited for several moments, listening for any signs of the creature's return, before finally relaxing his grip on the machete. "That was too close," he muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. He quickly gathered the rest of his supplies and made his way back to the campsite, his pace quickened by the lingering sense of unease. When Ethan returned, Nova greeted him with a series of chirps, its small body wriggling with excitement. The sight brought a smile to Ethan's face, easing the tension that had followed him from the jungle. "Miss me?" he asked, setting the basket down and crouching beside Nova. He ran a hand gently over the velociraptor's back, feeling the warmth of its scales beneath his palm. Nova nuzzled against his hand, its amber eyes shining with trust. Ethan's heart swelled at the sight. He had always admired dinosaurs from a scientific perspective, but this bond, this connection, was something entirely different. Nova wasn't just a subject of study. It was a companion, a life he had vowed to protect. As Ethan prepared lunch, he couldn't help but replay the encounter with the adult velociraptor in his mind. He wondered if it had been part of Nova's original pack, searching for its lost member. But the hostility in its gaze suggested otherwise. If anything, it had seen him and Nova as potential prey. The realization only strengthened Ethan's resolve. He needed to ensure Nova's safety, not just from predators but from the countless dangers that lurked in the jungle. And while he couldn't protect the velociraptor forever, he could give it a fighting chance. Over the next several days, Ethan worked tirelessly to create a more secure enclosure for Nova. Using sturdy branches and vines, he constructed a small pen near the campsite, complete with a sheltered area for the velociraptor to rest. Nova watched with curiosity as Ethan worked, occasionally chirping or nudging him as if to offer encouragement. The routine of caring for Nova became a source of solace for Ethan. Each morning, he would feed the velociraptor and check its injury, which was slowly beginning to heal. In the afternoons, they would explore the area around the campsite, with Nova hopping along beside him, its movements growing more confident with each passing day. Ethan marveled at the creature's intelligence. Nova seemed to understand his words, responding to simple commands and mimicking his gestures. The velociraptor's playful nature often brought a smile to Ethan's face, whether it was chasing after insects or splashing in a nearby stream. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Ethan said one evening as they sat by the campfire. Nova let out a soft chirp, curling up beside him and resting its head on his leg. Ethan stroked its back, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. But the jungle was never without its dangers. One night, as Ethan lay in his tent, he was jolted awake by a series of low growls and rustling noises outside. His heart raced as he grabbed his flashlight and machete, stepping out into the darkness. The growls grew louder, and Ethan's flashlight beam revealed a pair of glowing eyes in the shadows. It was another predator, larger than the velociraptor he had encountered before. Its massive frame and razor-sharp teeth marked it as a carnotaurus, a fearsome predator that ruled the jungle with brute strength. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the creature stepped closer, its gaze fixed on Nova's enclosure. The young velociraptor was awake, its body trembling as it let out a series of frightened chirps. "Stay back," Ethan shouted, brandishing the machete. But the carnotaurus was undeterred, its powerful legs propelling it toward the pen. Desperation surged through Ethan as he scrambled to find a way to protect Nova. He grabbed a burning branch from the campfire, waving it toward the predator in a bid to scare it off. The carnotaurus hesitated, its eyes narrowing as it snarled. Just as it seemed poised to attack, a deafening roar echoed through the jungle. Ethan froze, his heart pounding as the ground trembled beneath his feet. From the shadows emerged another figure, a towering Tyrannosaurus Rex, its massive jaws bared as it let out another earth-shaking roar. The carnotaurus turned, its confidence faltering as it faced the larger predator. For a moment, the two titans stared each other down, their growls reverberating through the night. Ethan watched in awe as the T-Rex lunged, its powerful jaws snapping at the carnotaurus. The smaller predator let out a furious roar before retreating into the jungle, disappearing into the darkness. The T-Rex turned its gaze toward the campsite, its golden eyes glinting in the firelight. Ethan held his breath, unsure of what the massive creature would do next. But instead of attacking, the T-Rex let out a low rumble and stepped back, its gaze shifting to Nova. The young velociraptor chirped softly, its trembling subsiding as the T-Rex let out a final, guttural growl before disappearing into the jungle. Ethan sank to his knees, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. The T-Rex had protected them, saved Nova. It was an act he could hardly believe, a moment that defied everything he thought he knew about these prehistoric creatures. As he turned to Nova, who was now nuzzling against his leg, Ethan felt a renewed sense of awe and wonder. The jungle was a place of danger, yes, but also of miracles. And tonight, he had witnessed one firsthand. The dawn broke slowly over the jungle, casting soft rays of golden light through the canopy. Ethan sat on a log near the remnants of the campfire, his mind still reeling from the events of the previous night. Nova was nestled beside him, its tiny body rising and falling with the rhythm of peaceful sleep. The young velociraptor seemed unaware of how close they had come to disaster, or the unlikely savior that had emerged from the shadows. Ethan gazed toward the dense foliage where the T-Rex had vanished hours earlier. The massive predator's unexpected intervention raised more questions than answers. Why had it chased off the carnotaurus? And why hadn't it attacked them afterward? Ethan had studied countless fossils and theories about dinosaur behavior, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of living among them. "You've got someone looking out for you, Nova," he murmured, stroking the velociraptor's back. "But I don't know why." Nova stirred, its amber eyes blinking open as it let out a soft chirp. It looked up at Ethan, tilting its head as if sensing his unease. The velociraptor nudged his hand with its snout, a small but comforting gesture that made Ethan smile despite his lingering worries. "All right," he said, standing and stretching. "We've got work to do. If we're staying here, we need to make this place safer." The morning was spent fortifying the enclosure. Ethan used thick branches and vines to strengthen the pen's walls, creating a barrier that he hoped would deter any curious predators. Nova watched from a patch of grass nearby, occasionally letting out chirps of encouragement. It was as if the young velociraptor understood the importance of Ethan's efforts, its sharp eyes following his every move. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan decided to take a break. He sat down beside Nova, wiping sweat from his brow as he reached for his canteen. The velociraptor chirped softly, nudging his arm before climbing onto his lap. Ethan laughed, the tension in his chest easing as Nova settled against him. "You're something else, you know that?" he said, scratching behind Nova's small crest. "I've never seen anything like you." Nova chirped again, its tail wagging slightly as it nuzzled against him. Ethan marveled at the bond they had formed in such a short time. This wasn't just an animal. It was a companion, a creature capable of trust and affection despite the harshness of its world. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to explore the area around the campsite. He needed to gather more supplies, and he wanted to ensure that there were no immediate threats nearby. Nova insisted on coming along, its injury healing well enough that it could walk with only a slight limp. Though Ethan was hesitant to bring the young Velociraptor, he knew it would be safer to keep Nova close. The jungle was alive with activity as they made their way through the underbrush. Birds darted between the trees, their colorful feathers glinting in the sunlight, while small reptiles scurried across the forest floor. Nova trotted beside Ethan, its sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with a mix of curiosity and caution. As they approached a small stream, Ethan paused to refill his canteen. Nova wandered to the water's edge, its reflection shimmering on the surface as it lapped at the cool liquid. Ethan smiled, watching the Velociraptor enjoy the moment of peace. But the tranquility didn't last long. A sudden rustling in the bushes made Ethan's heart race. He grabbed his machete, his eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Nova froze, its body tensing as it let out a low, warning chirp. From the shadows emerged a pack of compis, small, agile dinosaurs with sharp teeth and a tendency to hunt in groups. Though they were much smaller than Nova, their sheer numbers made them a threat. The leader of the pack hissed, its beady eyes fixed on the young Velociraptor. Ethan stepped in front of Nova, raising the machete as he tried to appear larger. "Back off," he shouted, his voice firm. The compis hesitated, their heads tilting as they sized up the human. But before they could decide whether to attack, Nova let out a fierce screech, its small body puffing up as it stood its ground. The Velociraptor bared its tiny teeth, snapping at the air in a display of unexpected bravery. To Ethan's surprise, the compis faltered. The leader let out a disgruntled hiss before retreating into the underbrush, the rest of the pack following close behind. Ethan exhaled, lowering the machete as he turned to Nova. "You're fearless, aren't you?" he said, his voice filled with admiration. Nova chirped, its tail wagging as if proud of its accomplishment. The encounter with the compis served as a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the jungle. Ethan knew they couldn't rely on luck, or even the mysterious T-Rex, for protection. If they were going to survive, Nova would need to learn how to defend itself. Over the next few days, Ethan began teaching the young Velociraptor basic survival skills. He encouraged Nova to practice pouncing on small targets, using pieces of fruit or sticks as stand-ins for prey. At first, Nova was hesitant, its movements clumsy and uncertain. But with each attempt, the Velociraptor grew more confident, its natural instincts kicking in. "You're a quick learner," Ethan said one afternoon as Nova successfully pounced on a bundle of leaves. The Velociraptor chirped happily, shaking the leaves in its jaws before looking up at him with bright eyes. Ethan couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Nova was growing stronger every day, its injury healing well and its playful energy returning. But he also knew that their time together was temporary. As much as it pained him to think about, Nova was a creature of the wild. One day it would need to return to its own kind. As they descended into the valley, Ethan kept a close eye on the Velociraptor pack. The adults moved with purpose, their sharp eyes scanning the area for prey. He knew they would be wary of an outsider, and he needed to approach carefully. When they were within a safe distance, Ethan stopped, crouching beside Nova. He placed a hand on the young Velociraptor's back, his voice gentle but firm. "This is it, Nova. This is where you belong." Nova looked up at him, its amber eyes filled with a mixture of trust and confusion. The Velociraptor chirped softly, nuzzling against Ethan's hand as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "You're going to be okay," Ethan said, his throat tightening. "You're strong, you're brave, and you're going to do amazing things." With a deep breath, he stood and stepped back, giving Nova the space to move forward. The young Velociraptor hesitated, its small frame trembling as it looked between Ethan and the pack. "Go on," Ethan encouraged, his voice breaking slightly. "It's time." Nova took a tentative step toward the pack, its movements slow and uncertain. The adult velociraptors noticed the approach, their heads snapping in Nova's direction. They let out low growls, their bodies tensing as they assessed the newcomer. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched, every fiber of his being willing Nova to succeed. The young velociraptor let out a soft chirp, its posture submissive as it moved closer to the pack. The adults exchanged glances, their growls subsiding as they began to recognize Nova as one of their own. One of the larger velociraptors, a female with striking blue markings, stepped forward, sniffing at Nova before nudging it gently. Nova chirped in response, its tail wagging slightly as it relaxed. The pack began to surround the young velociraptor, their movements protective rather than threatening. Ethan felt a surge of relief and pride as he watched Nova integrate with its own kind. It was a moment of triumph, but also of bittersweet finality. "Goodbye, Nova," he whispered, his voice barely audible. As the pack began to move away, Nova paused, turning to look back at Ethan one last time. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. Nova chirped softly, as if saying thank you, before turning to follow the pack into the jungle. Ethan stood alone on the ridge, the weight of the moment settling over him. Though his heart ached, he knew he had done the right thing. Nova was where it belonged, and the bond they had shared would stay with him forever. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in a warm, golden glow. Ethan took a deep breath, his chest filling with a mix of sadness and gratitude. The jungle had given him a gift, a connection that transcended species, a reminder of the resilience and beauty of life. As he turned to make his way back to the campsite, Ethan smiled, the memory of Nova etched into his heart. The jungle was vast and untamed, but it was also a place of miracles. And for Ethan, Nova would always be his greatest miracle of all. Ethan's footsteps were slow and measured as he made his way back toward the campsite. The jungle felt quieter than usual, as if the world itself was reflecting the void Nova's absence had left. Though the bond they had formed was brief in the grand scheme of things, it had changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The rustling of leaves and the occasional distant calls of dinosaurs accompanied him, but none of it seemed to register. His mind was consumed by thoughts of Nova, wondering how the young velociraptor was faring with its new pack. Would the others protect it, teach it, or would Nova struggle to adapt after spending so much time with him? Ethan shook his head, trying to push the worries aside. He had done everything he could to prepare Nova for this moment. It was time to trust that the little velociraptor's instincts would guide it. By the time Ethan reached the campsite, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the jungle floor. The sight of the familiar clearing brought a pang of nostalgia. Nova's presence had filled the space with a sense of energy and warmth, but now it felt empty. Ethan set down his pack and sat by the fire pit, staring at the cold ashes. He ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts heavy as the weight of solitude settled over him. He had come to the jungle seeking adventure and discovery, but what he had found was something far more personal. He sighed, pulling out his journal and flipping to a blank page. Writing had always been his way of processing emotions, and now was no different. As the pen moved across the paper, he began to recount the journey. The moment he found Nova, the bond they had formed, and the bittersweet goodbye. "I never thought I'd feel this way about a velociraptor," Ethan wrote. But Nova wasn't just any dinosaur. Nova was brave, curious, and full of life. Watching it grow and heal was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Letting go was hard, but it was the right thing to do. Nova belongs in the wild, with its own kind. The words came easily, as if they had been waiting to spill onto the page. Ethan described the moments that had stood out to him. The way Nova chirped with excitement when he returned to the campsite, the determination in its eyes as it practiced hunting, and the quiet comfort of having it curl up beside him at night. As he wrote, Ethan felt a sense of catharsis. The act of putting his thoughts into words helped him process the whirlwind of emotions he had been carrying. By the time he finished, the sun had set completely, and the jungle was bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. The next few days passed in a haze of routine. Ethan busied himself with tasks around the campsite, reinforcing the shelter, gathering food, and mapping out the surrounding area. But no matter how much he tried to distract himself, his thoughts kept drifting back to Nova. Every sound in the jungle made him pause, his heart skipping a beat as he wondered if the young Velociraptor had returned. But each time, it was only a bird, a rustling branch, or the distant call of a dinosaur. The absence was palpable, a reminder of the bond they had shared and the void it had left behind. One evening, as Ethan sat by the campfire, he heard a noise that made his breath catch. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of chirping. His heart raced as he stood, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Nova," he called out, his voice tinged with hope. The chirping grew louder, and from the shadows emerged a small figure. But it wasn't Nova. It was another young Velociraptor, its sleek body and sharp eyes marking it as one of the pack. Ethan's heart sank as he realized it wasn't the companion he had been hoping for. The Velociraptor approached cautiously, its head tilting as it studied him. Ethan held still, his instincts telling him not to make any sudden movements. He knew better than to assume the creature was friendly. It was wild, after all, and likely wary of humans. To his surprise, the Velociraptor let out a soft chirp, its posture relaxing slightly. Ethan knelt, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Hey there," he said softly. "What brings you here?" The Velociraptor chirped again, its eyes darting around the campsite as if searching for something. Ethan realized it was looking for Nova. The young Velociraptor must have mentioned him to the pack, or perhaps they had been watching from a distance all along. Over the next few hours, Ethan observed the Velociraptor, marveling at its behavior. It was curious but cautious, circling the campsite and sniffing at the remnants of the fire pit. Ethan offered it a piece of dried meat, which it accepted hesitantly, its sharp teeth tearing into the food. The encounter left Ethan with more questions than answers. Why had the Velociraptor sought him out? Was it a coincidence, or was there something more at play? He couldn't shake the feeling that Nova's presence had left an impact on the pack, and perhaps on him as well. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan settled into a new routine. The Velociraptor pack occasionally passed through the area, their sleek forms moving silently through the jungle. Though they kept their distance, Ethan felt a sense of connection to them, as if Nova had forged a bridge between their worlds. One evening, as Ethan sat by the fire, he heard a familiar chirp. His heart leapt as he turned, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Nova. The young Velociraptor's amber eyes shone in the firelight, its tail wagging slightly as it stepped forward. "Nova!" Ethan exclaimed, his voice filled with a mix of joy and disbelief. The Velociraptor chirped, bounding toward him with an energy that made Ethan laugh. Nova nuzzled against his leg, its sharp claws clicking against the ground as it expressed its excitement. Ethan knelt, wrapping his arms around Nova in a rare moment of vulnerability. "I missed you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think I'd see you again." Nova chirped softly, its trust and affection evident in every movement. Ethan marveled at the resilience of the bond they had formed, a connection that transcended the barriers of species and circumstance. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nova sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on the jungle floor. Ethan knew that Nova's return was temporary. The young Velociraptor belonged with its pack, and this visit was likely a fleeting moment of reunion. But for now, he chose to savor the time they had together. They sat in companionable silence, the sounds of the jungle blending with the crackling of the fire. Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in weeks, his heart full as he watched Nova curl up beside him. "You're a survivor," he said softly, stroking the Velociraptor's back. "And no matter where life takes you, I'll always be rooting for you." Nova chirped in response, its amber eyes reflecting the light of the flames. Ethan smiled, knowing that this moment, this connection, was something he would carry with him forever. As the first light of dawn pierced the canopy, Ethan woke to find Nova still curled up beside him. The young velociraptor's soft chirps in its sleep were a comforting sound, a reminder of the trust they had built. Ethan stretched quietly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful moment, but his mind was already racing with questions. Why had Nova returned? Was it simply a fleeting visit? Or was there something more to this reunion? Ethan had always considered himself a man of logic, but the bond he shared with Nova had begun to challenge his understanding of the world. How could something so wild and instinct-driven form such a deep connection with him? Nova stirred, its amber eyes fluttering open as it let out a soft yawn. The velociraptor looked up at Ethan, chirping softly as if to say good morning. Ethan smiled, reaching out to scratch behind its crest. "Morning, buddy," he said. "Sleep well." Nova chirped again, its tail wagging slightly as it stretched its small frame. Ethan chuckled, amazed at how much the velociraptor's personality shone through its every movement. Despite the uncertainty of their circumstances, Nova's presence brought him a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. As the morning progressed, Ethan decided to take Nova on a walk through the jungle. He wanted to see if the young velociraptor remembered the paths they had taken during their initial journey. To his surprise, Nova led the way with confidence, its sharp eyes scanning the terrain as if it had never left. Ethan followed closely, marveling at how much Nova had grown. Its movements were more graceful, its steps more deliberate. The velociraptor was no longer the injured, timid creature he had found. It was a survivor, thriving in the wild while still maintaining its unique bond with him. They reached the stream where they had rested during their journey to the pack. Nova paused at the water's edge, chirping softly as it looked around. Ethan knelt beside it, watching as the velociraptor dipped its snout into the cool water. "This place brings back memories, doesn't it?" Ethan said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Nova looked up at him, its amber eyes reflecting the sunlight. Ethan smiled, feeling a pang of bittersweet emotion. He knew their time together was limited, but he cherished every moment. As they continued through the jungle, Ethan noticed signs of Nova's pack nearby: claw marks on trees, scattered feathers, and the faint scent of the velociraptor's presence. He realized that Nova must have left the pack temporarily to visit him, a decision that both warmed his heart and filled him with concern. "You can't stay with me forever, you know," he said softly, glancing at Nova. "You belong with them," the velociraptor chirped, tilting its head as if trying to understand. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wanted to believe that their bond transcended the boundaries of nature, but he also knew that Nova's survival depended on its connection to the pack. By midday, they reached a clearing where the jungle gave way to a vast expanse of grassland. Ethan recognized the area from his earlier explorations. It was a hunting ground frequented by larger predators. He hesitated, debating whether to continue, but Nova's determined chirp pushed him forward. They hadn't gone far when the sound of heavy footsteps made Ethan freeze. He turned slowly, his heart pounding as he saw a massive figure emerging from the trees. It was the T-Rex, the same one that had saved them weeks ago. Its golden eyes locked onto Nova, and for a moment, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but he stood his ground, placing a protective hand on Nova's back. The T-Rex lowered its massive head, sniffing the air as it took a step closer. Nova chirped softly, its body tense but not fearful. To Ethan's astonishment, the T-Rex let out a low rumble, its posture shifting from predatory to almost gentle. It nudged Nova with its snout, a gesture that seemed more like recognition than aggression. Ethan watched in awe as the two creatures interacted, their connection defying everything he thought he knew about dinosaur behavior. "You know each other," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Nova chirped again, nuzzling against the T-Rex's snout. Ethan felt a surge of emotion as he realized the significance of the moment. The T-Rex wasn't just a random protector. It was a guardian, watching over Nova in ways he couldn't fully understand. The T-Rex turned its gaze to Ethan, its golden eyes piercing but not hostile. Ethan swallowed hard, his instincts urging him to lower his gaze, but he held his ground. For a moment, human and dinosaur regarded each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Finally, the T-Rex let out a low rumble, its massive frame retreating back into the jungle. Nova watched it go, chirping softly before turning back to Ethan. The Velociraptor's eyes shone with trust and affection, a bond unbroken despite the wild forces pulling them apart. Ethan knelt, placing a hand on Nova's back. "You're never alone, are you?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got your pack and you've got them," Nova chirped, nuzzling against his hand. Ethan smiled, his heart full even as he prepared to say goodbye once again. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the jungle in hues of orange and gold, Ethan and Nova returned to the edge of the valley. The Velociraptor pack was visible in the distance, their sleek forms moving gracefully through the grass. Ethan knelt beside Nova, his hand resting on the young Velociraptor's back. "This is it, buddy," he said softly. "Time to go home." Nova looked up at him, its amber eyes filled with understanding. It chirped once, a sound that carried both farewell and gratitude. Ethan felt his throat tighten as he gave Nova a gentle nudge toward the pack. The Velociraptor hesitated for a moment before turning to join its own kind. Ethan watched as Nova approached the pack, its small frame blending seamlessly with the others. The adults welcomed it with soft growls and nudges, their movements protective and accepting. Ethan stayed until the pack disappeared into the distance, his heart heavy but full. He knew he had done the right thing, even if it meant letting go of the bond that had brought him so much joy. The journey back to the campsite was quiet, the jungle's sounds blending into a soothing symphony. Ethan felt a sense of closure, knowing that Nova was where it belonged. The Velociraptor had taught him lessons he hadn't known he needed, about resilience, trust, and the beauty of connection. As he reached the campsite, Ethan sat by the fire pit, staring at the embers as they glowed softly in the darkness. He pulled out his journal, flipping to the final page. With steady hands, he began to write. Nova was more than a Velociraptor. Nova was a friend, a companion, and a reminder of the incredible bonds that can form in the most unexpected places. Our time together was brief, but it changed me forever. I'll always carry a part of Nova with me, no matter where life takes me. Ethan closed the journal, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The jungle stretched out before him, vast and untamed, but he no longer felt alone. Nova's spirit was with him, a testament to the extraordinary connection between two very different beings. As the stars filled the sky, Ethan leaned back, letting the sounds of the jungle lull him into a peaceful sleep. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it, carrying the memory of Nova as a guiding light. The jungle had given him a gift, a bond that transcended time and species. And for Ethan, that was the greatest adventure of all.